The mud is 6 inches deep. You can hear it, that particular sound, that thick, sucking, reluctant groan of Indiana clay releasing a tire's grip. It carries across a fairground like a note from a church organ. Low, final, unignorable. The year is 1987. The place is the Putnam County Fairgrounds, just outside Greencastle, Indiana. And in the middle of that mud-soaked pull track, surrounded by 200 people who have come to see something extraordinary, only to laugh at something old, stands a man named Earl Denton. He is 63 years old. He is wearing a green feed cap so faded it might have been yellow once. His boots are the same boots he wore to his daughter's wedding in 1974. And the machine behind him, the machine the crowd is already snickering at, is a 1952 Oliver Model 88 gasoline, bought used in 1961 for $480. And somewhere to his right, idling with the low-throttle growl of a $62,000 John Deere 8650, is a racing team that drove in from Indianapolis with a trailer, a logo on the side, and a certainty that today was going to be easy. They were wrong. Let me take you back. August 1987 in Putnam County, Indiana is a particular kind of summer, the kind that hasn't decided whether it wants to be beautiful or brutal. The corn is 8 feet tall in the good fields, just beginning to tassel, filling the air with that powdery green perfume that people who grow up in farm country never quite forget, even decades later, even in cities far away. The soybeans sit lower, patient, a darker green, like a second sentence waiting to be read. The county fair has been running at the Putnam County Fairgrounds every August since 1853. That is not a small thing. 134 years of harvest festivals, livestock competitions, 4-H ribbons, funnel cake, and the kind of community pride that doesn't announce itself, it just endures. The grandstand is wooden and painted white, and it needs a new coat and probably always will. The smells of the Midway diesel exhaust, caramel corn, frying oil mix with the earthier smell of the livestock barns just to the north. And on the far end of the fairgrounds, running parallel to Route 240, there is the pull track. Tractor pulling. Let me explain this briefly for those unfamiliar because it matters. A tractor pull is a test of a machine's ability to drag a weighted sled down a measured strip of ground, usually 300 feet. As the tractor moves forward, the sled's internal weight distribution shifts forward too, loading more and more pressure onto the front until the tractor either stalls or the sled refuses to move another inch. The machine that pulls the sled the farthest wins. Simple, ancient. Brutal in its honesty. In 1987, tractor pulling is serious business in the rural Midwest. The National Tractor Pullers Association, the NTPA, has been sanctioning events since 1969. Some of the modified pulling machines of this era produce over 5,000 horsepower. They are not farm tractors in any recognizable sense. They are dragsters with wheels. But this is not that kind of event. This is a county fair pull, a stock class event or close enough, meaning these are supposed to be tractors a man might actually use on a farm, and that distinction is everything. Let me tell you about Earl Denton. Earl was born in 1924, the third son of a corn farmer in the north part of Putnam County, in a community called Rochdale. He grew up during the Depression. Let that settle for a moment. He was 6 years old when the banks began to fail. He was 10 when the drought years came to Indiana, not as severe as they were further west, but severe enough to hollow out a farm family, severe enough to teach a boy that machinery was not a luxury, it was survival, and it had to be understood completely, not approximately. By the time Earl Denton was 18 years old, he could rebuild a magneto with his eyes half closed. He could diagnose a vapor lock by listening to how an engine coughed. He understood carburation, compression ratios, valve timing not from textbooks, which he had limited access to, but from engines themselves. From lying underneath them in January with frozen fingers and a trouble light, and a problem that had to be solved because the ground was not going to wait. He farmed his own land, 220 acres southwest of Greencastle, from 1949 until 2001. He raised corn and soybeans, kept a small herd of Angus cattle for most of the 1960s, and for 30 years was a fixture at the Putnam County Co-op, a man other farmers came to when something mechanical was wrong and they couldn't figure it out. He was not wealthy. He drove a 1979 Ford F-150 with rust along the wheel wells and a crack in the passenger side mirror he'd repaired with electrical tape. He wore the same 2 pairs of Carhartt bibs all winter. He didn't complain about this. He didn't talk about money much at all. What he had, what no amount of money could have purchased in its authentic form, was knowledge. Accumulated, specific, hard-won knowledge about how old engines work, and specifically about one engine in particular. The Oliver 8080 bought in 1961 was already 9 years old. It had been worked hard by its previous owner, a tobacco and grain farmer named Alvin Stout, who put nearly 4,000 hours on it before selling it to Earl for $480, which was at the time 2 months' worth of Earl's off-farm wages. Earl overhauled the engine himself that first winter. He rebuilt the carburetor. He reseated the valves. He adjusted the governor. And then he learned that machine the way you learn a person, not by reading about it, but by being with it, season after season, through mechanical crisis and mechanical triumph, until you understand not just what it does, but why it does it, and what it's capable of when pushed. That Oliver 88 had a 265 cubic inch, 6-cylinder gasoline engine. It produced from the factory approximately 47 horsepower at the drawbar. By 1987, with 35 years of careful maintenance and Earl's specific attention to valve timing and fuel mixture, it was producing closer to 52. He had never once had it professionally serviced. He had never needed to. Now let me tell you about the men on the other side of that pull track. The Hartwell racing crew was not a bad group of people. I want to be clear about that because this story is not about evil. It is about a particular kind of arrogance that wealth and novelty can produce, the arrogance of believing that new is always better, that expensive is always capable, and that a man with an old machine has nothing to teach you. Derek Hartwell was 31 years old in 1987. He owned an agricultural equipment dealership in Speedway, Indiana, the Indianapolis suburb that shares its name with the famous racing oval, and he was not coincidentally a serious motorsport enthusiast. He drove a white Chevrolet Suburban with a custom hitch and an enclosed trailer, and on the side of that trailer it said in red block letters, HARTWLLAGRI Performance. He had business cards. The tractor on that trailer was a John Deere 8650 1986 model year, turbocharged diesel, 235 horsepower at the PTO. In $1986, a new 8650 listed at approximately $62,000. Derek had purchased it used 1 season old for $54,000, and had spent an additional $4,200 having it set up specifically for pulling. New rear tires. Weight transfer modifications, a tuned injection pump. Derek Hartwell knew a great deal about horsepower. He followed the NTPA circuit. He had sponsors, modest ones, a local tire shop and an ag chemicals rep, but sponsors nonetheless. He arrived at the Putnam County Fair not to compete exactly, but to demonstrate. He had come to show people what a serious machine looked like. When his crew unloaded the 8650, green and yellow and enormous, the rear wheels 6 feet tall, the exhaust stack gleaming, the crowd gathered. People took photographs. Children climbed on the fence rails to see better. The machine smelled of fresh diesel and new rubber and competence. Derek walked the pull track with his hands in his back pockets, studying the soil conditions, calculating his approach. He wore a Hartwell Agri-Performance hat and a polo shirt with the same logo on the breast pocket. He had a digital wristwatch. He noticed Earl Denton and the Oliver 88 about 10 minutes after he arrived. He said, and this is a paraphrase, but only barely, he said to one of his crew members, loud enough that several bystanders heard it, "Is that thing actually entered, or is somebody just driving it to the scrap dealer and got confused?" The crew laughed. Earl heard it, he didn't turn around. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room, or a field, or a fairground, where someone's laughter carried further than they meant it to? Where a joke told quietly somehow filled the space and everyone heard it, and everyone knew they heard it, and the person it was aimed at knew they heard it too. That is what happened at the Putnam County Fairgrounds on August 14, 1987. The pull was organized by a man named Harold Kessler, who served as the event director for the fair's machinery competitions. Harold was a third-generation farmer and a deeply practical man who kept the schedule in a 3-ring binder and had been running this event for 9 years. He had a pull order posted on a piece of poster board near the registration table. Earl Denton had registered the Oliver 88 in the antique stock class, tractors manufactured before 1960, modified class, a category that in recent years had attracted modest interest, usually 5 or 6 entrants, usually pulling somewhere between 240 and 280 feet on the 300-foot track before the sled stopped them. Derek Hartwell had registered the John Deere 8650 in the open modified class, where he expected, accurately, to have very little serious competition. The trouble started when Harold Kessler, trying to fill time between categories and perhaps sensing an opportunity for drama, proposed an unofficial challenge pull. A side exhibition, no trophies, no NTPA points, just a gentleman's contest between the highest pulling antique entry and the top open-class machine. The crowd liked the idea immediately. Derek Hartwell's crew liked the idea immediately. Earl Denton stood at the registration table for a long moment, looking at Harold Kessler, and then he looked down the track and then he said, "All right." Derek walked over and offered his hand to shake and said, smiling broadly for the crowd that had begun to gather, "No offense to you or your machine, sir, but I want you to know before we start that I'm pulling almost 5 times your horsepower. I'd hate for you to be embarrassed." Earl shook his hand. He said, "It's not the horsepower that moves the sled." Derek laughed, his crew laughed, several people in the crowd laughed because the joke, if that's what it was a little opaque. What did that mean? Of course it was horsepower, what else would it be? But 2 or 3 of the older farmers standing near the fence did not laugh. One of them, a man named Clifford Watts, who was 71 years old and had farmed with a 1948 Farmall M for 30 years before switching to modern equipment, nudged his neighbor and said quietly, "He knows something." A side wager formed. This was not organized. Nobody passed a hat or wrote numbers on paper. It was the informal kind, $3 here, $5 there, spoken quietly between people who had known each other for decades. By the time the challenge pull was set to begin, approximately $340 had been wagered on the outcome, with the overwhelming majority of it on the John Deere 8650. Earl went back to his Oliver. He opened the hood and looked at the engine for about 30 seconds. He adjusted something, people nearby couldn't quite see what. He closed the hood. He climbed up into the seat. He looked out over the pull track, and his expression, according to people who were watching him closely, was not nervous or defiant or excited. It was patient. Now I need to stop here and explain something technical because the story doesn't make sense without it. And I promise you, this is more interesting than it sounds. Horsepower and torque are not the same thing. Most of us have been taught or have absorbed without anyone teaching us that horsepower is what makes a machine powerful. And in the world of racing, of top speed, of sustained high RPM performance, that is largely true. Horsepower is what happens when you have lots of torque happening very, very fast. But torque is the root of it. Torque is the raw rotational force that an engine produces at the crankshaft. It is the grunt, the pull, the physical effort the engine is making before any multiplication through gearing has happened. And in tractor pulling, where you are not trying to go fast, where you are trying to move a load that is getting progressively harder to move, what you need is torque. Specifically, what you need is low-end torque. Torque that is available at low RPMs before the engine has spun up, before it has found its stride. Here is the crucial distinction. A high-horsepower turbocharged diesel engine, like the John Deere 8650's 466 cubic inch 6-cylinder, produces its peak torque at relatively high RPM. The turbocharger needs to spool up. The power curve climbs as engine speed climbs. In a field or on a pull track, if the engine lugs down under a heavy load before the turbo has come on, power drops away rapidly. The Oliver 88's naturally aspirated 265 cubic inch gasoline engine, running on a wide-open throttle, with its relatively low compression ratio and its heavy cast-iron flywheel, produced its maximum torque at very low RPM, somewhere around 900 to 1,100 RPM. This was by design. The Oliver 88 was engineered in the late 1940s by engineers who understood that farmers needed pulling power in difficult ground, muddy fields, deep tillage, where wheel spin was the enemy and lugging the engine was the reality. They tuned the engine, specifically and deliberately, to maximize low RPM torque. And Earl Denton, in 35 years of working with this machine, had come to understand this in his bones. He knew that if he kept the engine in its ideal RPM band, not racing it, not lugging it, just holding it steady in that narrow window where the old gasoline 6 found its strength, the machine would pull. More than that, he understood something about soil mechanics that the younger men on Derek Hartwell's crew did not fully appreciate, which is that in soft ground, big tires spinning fast pack down the soil in front of them and create a compaction berm that adds resistance. Slower, steadier wheel rotation with less slip was more efficient in soft clay. Earl had been pulling this Oliver 88 in informal competitions at county fairs since 1963, 24 years. He had pulled it in wet springs and dry falls, in clay soil and sandy loam, with the sled loaded heavy and light. He had not won every time, he had lost plenty of times, but he had learned, and he had tuned. There was one more thing Earl knew, that summer of 1987. He had spent the previous 2 weekends, the 2 weekends before the Putnam County Fair, adjusting the carburetor needle jet on the Oliver's single-barrel Marvel-Schebler TSX carburetor. A small adjustment, less than a quarter turn. But he'd been searching for the exact fuel mixture that would give him the best torque response in the RPM range between 950 and 1050. And 2 Saturdays before the fair, sitting in the barn with a dial tachometer borrowed from a friend, he had found it. He had written the setting down in a small brown notebook he kept on a shelf above the workbench. He had told no one about this. The John Deere 8650 went first. Harold Kessler had determined this by a coin flip, and Derek Hartwell had won the flip and chosen to go first, a decision that made tactical sense if you believed the competition was one-sided, because going first meant setting a mark the other driver had to beat, applying pressure. The 8650 backed up to the pull sled's hitch. The hitch man connected the chain with a practiced click and stood clear. Derek Hartwell, wearing his Hartwell Agri-Performance hat, straightened in the seat, blipped the throttle twice. The crowd could feel the turbo pressure in their chests and took a breath. He dropped the clutch. The John Deere launched. There is no other word for it. The massive rear tires bit into the clay, the turbo screamed, the exhaust stack threw a black hat of smoke into the August air, and the sled moved. It moved fast, actually faster than most of the crowd expected. The digital horsepower readout on the sled's scoreboard climbed immediately. The crowd roared. Children on the fence rails grabbed the top rail with both hands. Derek held the RPMs high, the turbo on song, the sled tracking true down the center of the pull track. He pulled 271 feet before the sled's forward weight transfer overcame the tractor's effort and the wheels broke loose in a spray of clay, spun uselessly for a moment, and the sled stopped. 271 feet. That was not a bad pull. In the open class at a county fair, 271 feet was competitive. The crowd applauded. Derek climbed down from the cab and his crew immediately came forward to clap him on the back, and he walked back toward the starting position with the easy, certain stride of a man who believes the contest is over. He stopped about 30 feet from Earl Denton and said in a voice that carried, "Your turn, sir, take your time." Then he folded his arms across his chest and waited. Earl Denton did not look at him. Earl was doing something with the throttle lever, making a small adjustment, his eyes closed, listening. He had his left hand resting on the fuel line. He was taking the engine's temperature by feel, an old habit, one that a younger generation would have called superstition, but that Earl understood as information. The engine was warm, not hot, warm. This was exactly what he wanted. He climbed down, walked to the back of the Oliver, and knelt briefly in the clay. He pressed his thumb into the soil. He looked at the pull track, at the twin ruts Derek's massive tires had left, at the compacted berm of clay that had been pushed forward by those spinning tires. He stood up. He walked back to the front of the Oliver and made one final adjustment to the choke, barely a touch. He climbed back up. Now the crowd had gone quieter, not silent, not yet, but quieter. There's a moment at these events when the spectators sense, even before the machines speak, that something is about to happen. It's a shift in attention, a collective leaning forward. The older farmers on the fence rail had already been quiet. They had been watching Earl from the moment he'd knelt in the clay. Earl engaged the PTO, even though he had nothing attached to it. He engaged it briefly and let it run for a second, an old driver's trick to feel the drivetrain. Then he disengaged it, settled into the seat, and let the engine drop to idle. That is what people remember, that he let the engine drop to idle. The Oliver 88 at idle produced a sound unlike the sounds of modern tractors. It was a slower, thicker, more deliberate rhythm, a sound with gaps in it that you could almost count. The 6 cylinders firing in sequence with a low, steady authority, not the whine of a turbo, not the urgency of a racing engine. the sound of an engine that was not in a hurry and did not need to be. The hitchman connected the chain. Earl moved the throttle lever forward, not to wide open, not immediately, but to a position he knew by feel, a position he'd marked with a small notch in the lever guide with a file years ago. 950 RPM. He let out the clutch. The Oliver moved. What happened next is difficult to describe adequately in words, and that is unusual, because words are usually sufficient for mechanical events. But this one had a quality that people who were there have returned to in conversation many times since. The machine did not lurch, it did not spin. The massive rear tires of the 8650 had torn up the pull track's surface, leaving it broken and irregular. Anyone looking at that track would have bet against traction. But Earl had moved deliberately to one side, not the center, where the 8650 had packed and broken the soil, but slightly off-center, where the original firm clay still held. The Oliver 88 leaned forward. That is really the only way to describe the quality of it. The engine did not roar. The exhaust did not throw smoke. The RPM barely changed. Earl kept it locked in that narrow window around 1,000 revolutions per minute, reading the resistance through the seat of his pants and his hands on the steering wheel, making tiny adjustments, tiny corrections, the way a pilot holds altitude on instruments in smooth air. The sled moved. It moved with a slowness that was deeply strange to watch. Not fast like the 8650 had moved it. Slow, steady, inexorable, the word that a retired mechanical engineer named Franklin Morse, who was standing at the fence that day and who has spoken about this event many times, the word that Frank later used was inexorable. He said it felt like watching gravity operate. 200 feet, the sled's weight transfer was heavy now. This was the point where most machines in this class began to struggle, where the load exceeded the engine's willingness. Earl did not change the throttle. 220 feet. The engine note dropped just barely, just a few RPM as the load increased. Earl's right hand moved slightly on the throttle lever, bringing it up a touch. The note steadied. 240 feet. 250. The crowd, which had been making the kind of noise a crowd makes when it's pretending to be patient, had gone quiet. 260. 262. 265. Derek Hartwell had unfolded his arms. 268. 270. 271 feet, tied. 272 feet. The Oliver 88 pulled 281 feet before the wheels broke loose. Earl brought the throttle back, engaged the brake, and the machine stopped in a shallow spray of clay. He sat in the seat for a moment, looking down the track at where the sled had halted. Then he shut the engine off. The fairground was, for one long moment, completely quiet. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows something unexpected. It is not the silence of indifference. It is not the silence of boredom. It is the silence of a crowd that has just been required to rearrange its understanding of something and has not quite finished doing so. It is the silence of people who laughed an hour ago and are now, privately, accounting for that laughter. People who were at the Putnam County Fairgrounds that day have described the next 30 or 40 seconds in consistent terms. The crowd did not break into immediate applause. There was a beat, a long beat, that felt unusual, slightly outside of normal time. Harold Kessler looked at his measurement twice. Derek Hartwell stood at the edge of the pull track with his arms at his sides, and he did not move for a moment. His crew had gone quiet. One of them, a young man in his 20s who'd been the most vocal in his laughter earlier, turned and walked back toward the trailer. It was an older man in the crowd who started the applause. Clifford Watts, 71 years old, standing at the fence rail in overalls and a white t-shirt, who had said earlier quietly, "He knows something." Clifford Watts began to clap, not enthusiastically, not performatively. A steady, slow clap, the kind that means something specific. Others joined. By the time Earl climbed down from the Oliver 88, the applause was full and warm and real. He walked to the back of the tractor and unhooked the chain himself, coiling it and handing it to Harold Kessler. He removed his feed cap, the faded green one, and held it against his chest for a moment, not in triumph exactly, but in acknowledgement of the machine, of the crowd, of the moment. Derek Hartwell walked over. He stood in front of Earl Denton for a moment and then he said, and this is reported by multiple witnesses to be close to verbatim, "I owe you an apology and an explanation, if you've got time for one." Earl said, "I've got time." They stood at the edge of the pull track for about 15 minutes, talking. Nobody who was close enough to hear them has been willing to say exactly what was said in those 15 minutes. What people report is that at one point, Earl opened the hood of the Oliver 88 and pointed at something on the carburetor, and Derek Hartwell leaned in and looked for a long time. Let me tell you what happened in the years after that August afternoon. The most immediate consequence was financial and modest. Earl Denton collected approximately $180 from the informal wagers, the portion of the $340 that had been placed on his behalf by older farmers who knew. He used $40 of it to buy dinner for Clifford Watts and two other friends at a diner in Greencastle. He put the rest in an envelope and gave it to the Putnam County 4-H, anonymously, as a contribution to the youth mechanics program. Derek Hartwell's response to that afternoon was, by all accounts, genuine. He drove back to Greencastle the following Saturday. He called ahead. Harold Kessler gave him Earl's number and asked if he could visit. Earl said yes. Derek arrived with a notepad and spent 4 hours in Earl's barn watching Earl walk through the Oliver 88's engine, carburetor, and drivetrain. He asked questions. Earl answered them. They drank coffee from a thermos that Earl's wife, Ruth, brought out around 2 in the afternoon. What Derek carried away from that visit was specific knowledge about torque curves and carburation tuning that, his own words, in a letter he wrote to Earl about 6 months later, "I thought I already understood, but I realized I understood it theoretically and you understand it practically, and those are two completely different things." In 1989, Derek Hartwell restructured his dealership to add a vintage equipment repair and restoration service. This was not a common business offering at the time. The idea, Earl's indirect influence, though Earl never claimed credit for it, was that there were thousands of small operations across the Midwest still running old iron machines from the 1940s through the 1960s that nobody in the modern dealer network knew how to work on properly. Derek hired 2 mechanics who had come up through that older tradition, and he paid them well, and within 3 years the vintage service department was contributing meaningfully to the dealership's revenue. Earl Denton farmed his 220 acres until 2001, when he was 77 years old. He retired not because his health failed. He was, his daughter has said, constitutionally stubborn about health, but because his knees had simply declared that they had formed an opinion and were not interested in further negotiation. He sold the farming operation to a neighboring family, the Hendersons, keeping the house and 5 acres. He kept the Oliver 88. He kept it in the same barn, cleaned and covered, and he ran the engine for 30 minutes every 2 weeks, the way you would maintain a relationship, regularly, not neglectfully, without requiring it to produce anything, just keeping the connection alive. He died in March of 2009 at the age of 84. Ruth had preceded him by 3 years. His daughter, Sandra Denton Kowalczyk, and his son, Gary, were both with him. At the funeral, held at a Methodist church in Rochdale, a man drove nearly 2 hours from Indianapolis to attend. He sat in the back. After the service, he introduced himself to Sandra as Derek Hartwell. He was 53 years old by then, gray at the temples. He told her that her father had taught him something important and that he had tried to pass it along and that he thought she should know. Sandra said later that she wasn't sure exactly what he meant at the time, but people at the funeral who were old enough to remember August 1987 understood. The Oliver 88 passed to Gary Denton. It was appraised in 2011 for insurance purposes at $4,200, a modest sum, but Gary has made clear on multiple occasions that the tractor is not for sale. He still runs the engine for 30 minutes every 2 weeks. There's one more thread worth following. Among the young men who had been part of Derek Hartwell's crew in 1987, the one who had laughed loudest and walked away first, there was a 24-year-old named Kevin Marsh. Kevin had grown up in Indianapolis, had gone to Purdue for 2 years before dropping out, and had come to work for Derek Hartwell because he liked engines and liked the feeling of being around capable machinery. Kevin Marsh went home from Putnam County and spent the next several weeks thinking about what he'd seen. In 1988, he enrolled in an agricultural mechanics program at Vincennes University. He graduated in 1990. For the next 30 years, he worked as a freelance agricultural equipment technician, specializing in vintage and antique machinery. He has rebuilt hundreds of engines from the 1940s through the 1960s, Oliver's, Farmall's, Allis-Chalmers, Minneapolis's, John Deere's, and he charges more than any dealer in western Indiana, and he has a 3-month waiting list. He has never forgotten the Oliver 88 pulling 281 feet. He tells people that story sometimes when they ask him how he got started. He tells it the same way every time, accurately and without embellishment, and always ends with the same words: "I was on the wrong side of that fence. I figured I should spend the rest of my career climbing back." Let me ask you one last question before we close. What do you think you know? Not what you've been told, not what the numbers on a specification sheet say, not what the horsepower rating indicates or the price tag implies or the logo on the side promises. What do you actually know from direct experience, from attention, from the long, patient accumulation of understanding that can only come from being with something through all its seasons? Earl Denton never read a textbook about engine torque curves. He didn't have a dynamometer. He didn't have a crew or a budget or a laptop loaded with performance data. What he had was 35 years of attention. 35 years of listening to one engine in one machine in one piece of Putnam County clay, until the relationship between the two of them, between Earl and that Oliver 88, had deepened past knowledge into something closer to fluency. There's a thing that happens in the agricultural world and in any craft world, really, when a person and a tool have been together long enough. The tool stops being external to the person. It becomes an extension. The farmer doesn't operate the machine. The farmer and the machine are in conversation, and both parties have something to say. In 1987, the world was accelerating. Computers were arriving in offices and then in homes. The agricultural equipment industry was producing machines of staggering power and complexity. Horsepower numbers were climbing every year. The old ways, the old machines, the old knowledge were beginning to seem to some people like relics, like things worth smiling at politely before moving on. Earl Denton didn't argue with any of that. He just went and pulled 281 feet. The lesson here is not that old is always better. The John Deere 8650 was a magnificent machine. Its 235 horsepower represented decades of engineering progress. Derek Hartwell was not a foolish man. He was, in fact, a man capable of learning, which is the mark of a genuinely intelligent person. The lesson is about what we discard too quickly, about the knowledge that lives in the hands of older men and women, in the memories of people who have spent their lives in relationship with specific tools and specific land, knowledge that cannot be downloaded or purchased or achieved in an afternoon. About the dangerous assumption that what is new is therefore superior in all conditions, and that what is old has nothing left to teach. The lesson is about patience, Earl's patience with his machine, with his knowledge, with the crowd's laughter. He did not need to defend himself. He did not need to explain. He understood that the pull track would say what needed to be said in a language older than argument. And the lesson is about the quiet men, the ones who don't announce what they know. The ones who show up at county fairs in faded green caps and boots that have been to weddings, driving machines that people photograph with a certain ironic fondness. The ones who make one small adjustment to a carburetor, close the hood, and climb up into the seat with the expression of a person who is not nervous. Those men know something. Pay attention to them. Historical context is real. The Oliver Model 88, the John Deere 8650, the National Tractor Pullers Association, and tractor pull events at county fairs across the rural Midwest are historically documented. Putnam County, Indiana and the Putnam County Fair are real. All characters, Earl Denton, Derek Hartwell, Harold Kessler, Clifford Watts, Kevin Marsh, and all others named, are fictional and created for storytelling purposes. All dialogue is dramatized.